close your eyes and let your mind drift across the centuries, back to a land where mist clings to mountain peaks like the breath of sleeping dragons, where cherry blossoms fall like snow in spring, and where the gentle sound of temple bells echoes across valleys filled with emerald rice paddies. This is medieval Japan, a realm where honor was more precious than gold, where the way of the sword became the way of the soul. Imagine the scent of burning incense drifting from wooden temples nestled among ancient cedar groves, the whisper of silk kimono against polished tatami mats, the distant rhythmic clack of a bamboo fountain marking time in a monastery garden. Here, in this world of profound beauty and rigid discipline, emerged a warrior class unlike any other in human history. The samurai. They were more than soldiers, more than protectors of the realm. They became the embodiment of an entire philosophy, a way of living that transformed the brutal necessity of warfare into something approaching art, something touching the sacred. Their story unfolds like morning mist, slowly revealing the outline of Mount Fuji, gradually, inevitably, with a beauty that takes your breath away. In the beginning, there was poetry. This might seem a strange way to begin the story of Japan's greatest warriors, but it contains a truth as essential as steel and as enduring as stone. During the Heian period, from 794 to 1185, Japan existed as a realm of almost impossible refinement, where the imperial court in Kyoto devoted itself to the composition of 31-syllable poems, to the appreciation of seasonal changes reflected in the color of court robes, to the subtle art of blending incense into combinations that could evoke specific emotions or memories. Picture the Heian court on a moonlit evening in spring, where nobles in flowing silks gather beside artificial streams that wind through manicured gardens, each person contributing lines to an endless collaborative poem. Their voices soft as falling petals, their greatest ambition to craft a verse so perfect it would be remembered for 1,000 years. The emperor himself might spend entire days contemplating the proper shade of purple for his sleeves, while court ladies created literature that would survive the ages, their long black hair cascading like waterfalls over silk cushions as they wrote by lamplight. Yet even in this world of aesthetic perfection, shadows were gathering, beyond the capital's elegant boundaries, in the rough provinces where mountain streams carved their way through forest valleys, where farmers worked rice fields that stretched to distant horizons. A different reality was taking shape. The central government, absorbed in its cultural pursuits, found it increasingly difficult to maintain order in these remote regions. Local governors, appointed from the capital, often proved ineffective when faced with bandits, rebellious peasants, or disputes over land rights. It was here, on the margins of the refined world, that the samurai first emerged. Not as a planned creation of government policy, but as an organic response to practical necessity.
Why?
Provincial landowners began to maintain small groups of armed retainers, men who could ride horses and draw bows, who understood the value of loyalty and the necessity of violence. These early warriors were often younger sons of noble families, men who had little hope of advancement in the court system, but who possessed the education and bearing of aristocrats. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, these provincial warriors began to develop their own culture, their own values, their own understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. They adopted Chinese military treatises, but adapted them to Japanese conditions. They studied the way of the horse and the bow, but they also learned to appreciate poetry and calligraphy. They were creating, without fully realizing it, a synthesis between the refined culture of the court and the practical demands of frontier life. The transformation was gradual, like the way morning light slowly illuminates a landscape, revealing details that had been hidden in darkness. A provincial warrior might begin his day practicing archery in his compound's courtyard, the rhythmic twang of the bowstring punctuating the morning air, then spend his afternoon copying Chinese philosophical texts, his brush moving across rice paper with the same precision he brought to his martial arts. His wife might manage the household finances with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to arranging flowers or preparing tea. Two great clans began to emerge from this provincial warrior culture, their names destined to echo through Japanese history like thunder rolling between mountain peaks. The Minamoto, known for their skill with horses and their fierce independence, established their power base in the Kanto region, where the Great Plains stretched eastward from the mountains toward the sea. The Taira, equally proud and martial, built their strength in the western provinces, where they learned to navigate not only mountain trails, but also the political currents of the imperial court. The rivalry between these clans was not merely political, it was cultural, representing two different visions of what the emerging warrior class might become. The Taira succeeded brilliantly in court politics, intermarrying with the imperial family and effectively controlling the government by the middle of the 12th century. Their red banners flew from every important building in Kyoto. Their warriors wore court dress as comfortably as armor. Their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, became, in all but name, the ruler of Japan. Yet their very success contained the seeds of their destruction, for it awakened the fierce pride of their rivals and convinced many that the Taira had forgotten their warrior origins in pursuit of court luxury. The Minamoto, by contrast, remained in their eastern strongholds, cultivating a different kind of warrior culture, one that emphasized loyalty to leaders rather than to abstract principles, personal bonds forged in battle rather than elegant alliances negotiated in palace corridors. The tension between these approaches created a dynamic that would shape Japanese history for centuries. Was the warrior class to be absorbed into the existing court culture, becoming essentially aristocrats who happened to carry swords? Or were they to create something entirely new, a government based on martial values rather than aesthetic refinement? The answer would come through war, but even in these early days, the philosophical foundations were being laid for a unique cultural synthesis, one that could value both the cherry blossom and the sword, both the tea ceremony and the cavalry charge. As the Heian period drew to its close, the provincial warriors who had once seemed so marginal to the refined world of the capital were beginning to understand their own significance. They possessed something the court aristocrats had lost, the ability to act decisively, to inspire loyalty, to impose their will on a chaotic world. They were developing not just military skills, but a moral philosophy, a code of conduct that would eventually be called Bushido, the way of the warrior. This code emerged not from theoretical speculation, but from practical experience, from the daily reality of men who had chosen to serve others at the risk of their own lives. It emphasized loyalty above personal gain, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, acceptance of death as the ultimate test of one's commitment to duty. Yet it also valued education, artistic accomplishment, and spiritual development. For these warriors understood instinctively that strength without wisdom was mere brutality. Dawn breaks over the samurai compound with a quality of light that seems both gentle and purposeful, filtering through the geometric patterns of shoji screens and casting precise shadows across polished wooden floors. In these quiet moments before the household stirs, before the day's duties assert their claims, there exists a perfect stillness that contains within it all the accumulated wisdom of generations. The samurai rises before the sun, as his father did, and his father's father before him. not from necessity but from choice, from an understanding that the day's first moments belong to the cultivation of inner strength. His breath is visible in the cool morning air as he kneels in seiza, the formal sitting position that straightens the spine and focuses the mind, preparing himself through meditation for whatever challenges the day might bring. Picture this morning, ritual in all its quiet dignity. The warrior's hands rest lightly on his thighs, his breathing slow and deliberate, his attention turned inward to that place where courage lives, where doubt dissolves, where the ego's constant chatter gives way to something deeper and more reliable. Around him, the world slowly awakens, the soft shuffle of servants preparing the morning meal, the distant sound of temple bells marking the hour, the whisper of wind through the bamboo grove that borders the compound. The act of dressing becomes a meditation in itself, each garment layered with intentionality and meaning. First comes the fundoshi, the simple loincloth that speaks to the warrior's acceptance of life's basic requirements without shame or pretense. Then the white silk underkimono, smooth and cool against the skin, a reminder that beneath the armor and formality, the samurai remains human, vulnerable, mortal. The hakama trousers follow, their wide legs allowing for the fluid movement required in combat, while their formal appearance maintains the dignity appropriate to his station. But it is the handling of the swords that transforms the morning routine, from mere preparation into something approaching the sacred. The katana and wakizashi are not merely weapons, they are the soul of the warrior made visible, extensions of his will and manifestations of his honor. The way he lifts each blade from its stand, examines the edge with reverent attention, adjusts the position in his sash. These actions carry the weight of ceremony, the recognition that he is handling not just steel but responsibility itself. The household around him operates with the same quiet efficiency, each person understanding their role in the larger harmony of the compound. His wife, accomplished in arts that require years to master, moves through her own morning rituals with grace that would impress the finest court ladies. Her day will be filled with responsibilities that require intelligence, diplomacy, and strength. Managing the household finances, overseeing the education of the children, maintaining relationships with other samurai families that might prove crucial in times of crisis. Watch her as she kneels before the family altar, lighting incense sticks whose smoke rises like prayers made visible, her hands folded in reverence for ancestors whose sacrifices made possible this morning, this household, this continuation of values across generations. She understands, perhaps even more clearly than her husband, that the samurai way of life depends not just on individual courage, but on the careful preservation of cultural knowledge, on the transmission of wisdom from parent to child, on the maintenance of traditions that give meaning to sacrifice. Their children, even the youngest, participate in this daily cultivation of character. The boy, perhaps 7 years old, kneels beside his father during morning meditation, his small body unconsciously mimicking the adult posture, his mind beginning to absorb through repetition the disciplines that will shape his entire life. Later, he will practice calligraphy with the same focused attention he brings to sword forms, understanding instinctively that both require the cultivation of ki. The daughter, equally beloved and equally trained in the requirements of her station, learns the arts of poetry and flower arrangement, not as mere accomplishments, but as forms of spiritual discipline. Her brush moves across rice paper with deliberate precision as she copies classical texts, each character a lesson in patience and attention to detail. When she arranges flowers from the family garden, she is learning to see beauty in impermanence, to find grace in the acknowledgement of mortality lessons that will serve her well in a world where loss is always possible. Breakfast unfolds as a quiet ceremony, the family kneeling around low tables, while servants present simple foods arranged with aesthetic precision. Rice gleams white as snow in lacquered bowls, miso soup steams in ceramic vessels, pickled vegetables provide colors that please the eye as much as flavors that awaken the palate. They eat mostly in silence, not from unfriendliness, but from a recognition that meals are opportunities for mindfulness. Chances to practice gratitude for the farmers whose labor provides sustenance, for the craftsman whose skill creates beautiful vessels, for the natural world that makes all human life possible. The morning's work varies with the season and the family's specific responsibilities, but it always includes elements that might seem contradictory to those unfamiliar with samurai culture. Physical training occupies several hours, not just swordwork and archery, but also horsemanship, swimming, and running that builds endurance for long campaigns. Yet, equal time is devoted to intellectual pursuits, the study of military treatises that analyze famous battles, the memorization of poetry that cultivates emotional sensitivity, the practice of Go and chess that develops strategic thinking. In the afternoon, the samurai might meet with other retainers to discuss the management of his lord's domain, reviewing tax records with the same meticulous attention he brings to examining his sword blades, understanding that good governance requires both martial prowess and administrative competence. These gatherings often extend beyond mere business, becoming forums for the discussion of philosophy, literature, and the complex ethical questions that arise when ideals meet reality. The household's evening rituals mirror the morning's in their careful attention to form and meaning. The family gathers again for the evening meal, this time perhaps joined by guests whose presence turns the occasion into an opportunity for cultural exchange. Conversation flows around topics that would surprise those who imagine samurai as mere fighting machines. The proper interpretation of classical Chinese poetry, the relative merits of different schools of Buddhist philosophy, the aesthetic principles that should guide the design of gardens. As night falls and the compound settles into quietude, the samurai performs his final duty of the day, the inspection of his equipment and the preparation of his mind for whatever tomorrow might bring. He cleans his swords with movements that have become second nature, each stroke of the polishing cloth both practical maintenance and meditative practice. He reviews the day's events, not with pride or regret, but with the objective attention of a strategist analyzing a completed battle, seeking lessons that might improve future performance. In the darkness before sleep, lying on his futon beside his wife while their children dream in nearby rooms, the samurai experiences the profound satisfaction that comes from a day lived in accordance with deeply held principles. Every action has been performed with attention, every responsibility met with dedication, every moment infused with awareness of the larger purposes that give individual existence its meaning. This daily rhythm, repeated countless times across generations, created the foundation for everything the samurai would accomplish in the larger theater of history. It was in these quiet moments of personal discipline that they developed the character that would enable them to face death without flinching, to maintain loyalty despite personal cost, to find beauty even in the midst of conflict. The way of the warrior began not on the battlefield but in the home, not in moments of crisis, but in the patient cultivation of virtue through countless ordinary days. In the pre-dawn darkness of a temple courtyard, where ancient stones have absorbed centuries of moonlight, and the subtle fragrance of incense lingers like whispered prayers, the true mystery of samurai culture begins to unfold. Here, in the space between night and morning, between earth and sky, between the mortal and the eternal, warriors gather to practice forms that are simultaneously deadly combat techniques and moving meditations on the nature of existence itself. The wooden practice swords cut through the air with a sound like wind, through bamboo, rhythmic, purposeful, almost musical in their precision. Each movement flows into the next, with the inevitability of water following its course down a mountainside. Yet behind this apparent effortlessness lies years of dedicated training. Thousands of hours spent in the patient cultivation of what the masters call mind like water, a state of consciousness that can respond instantly and appropriately to any stimulus without the interference of fear, anger, or selfish desire. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of this training ground, watching as a senior student demonstrates a kata, a formal sequence of techniques performed alone, as if fighting invisible opponents. His feet whisper across the raked gravel, their placement precise as a calligrapher's brushstrokes, his body moving through postures that tell a story without words. Each stance represents a different aspect of combat strategy. The aggressive forward lean that commits everything to a decisive attack, the defensive crouch that prepares for a counterstrike, the neutral position that waits for the opponent to reveal his intentions. But to see only the physical movements is to miss the deeper significance of what unfolds before you. The student's breathing remains steady despite the intensity of his exertion, his eyes focused not on any particular point, but on everything simultaneously, his mind empty of everything except pure awareness. He has spent years learning to quiet the internal dialogue that normally fills human consciousness. The constant stream of worry, planning, remembering, judging that prevents most people from experiencing the present moment directly. This mental discipline, borrowed and adapted from Zen Buddhism, became the foundation of all advanced samurai training. The warriors understood, perhaps more clearly than the monks who taught them, that victory in combat depended less on physical technique than on psychological preparation. A fighter who hesitated, who allowed fear to cloud his judgment, who became attached to particular outcomes, was already defeated regardless of his skill with weapons. But a warrior who had learned to dissolve his ego into pure responsiveness, who could act without the burden of self-consciousness, became something approaching unstoppable. The relationship between samurai and their swords embodied this fusion of practical necessity and spiritual development. A katana was never merely a weapon, it was a sacred object crafted by master swordsmiths who approached their work as a form of religious practice. These artisans would purify themselves through fasting and prayer before beginning the forging process, understanding that their spiritual state would somehow be transmitted into the steel itself. They folded the metal thousands of times, creating layers that gave the blade both flexibility and strength, working with fire and water and their own disciplined will to produce instruments of such perfection that they seemed to possess consciousness. When a young samurai received his first real katana, the ceremony carried the solemnity of religious ordination. The sword was not simply given, but formally presented with elaborate protocols that recognized the magnitude of the moment. The recipient understood that he was accepting not just a weapon, but a responsibility to himself, to his teacher, to the long line of warriors who had carried such blades before him. The sword would become an extension of his body, a manifestation of his will, a constant reminder of his commitment to the warrior path. Daily practice with the sword became a form of active meditation, each session beginning with a period of quiet centering, a moment of gratitude for the teachers who had transmitted the techniques, a recognition of the serious purpose behind what might appear to observers as mere physical exercise. The warrior would perform saburi, hundreds of cutting motions repeated with absolute focus, each one designed to build not just muscle memory, but mental discipline. The monotonous repetition induced a trance-like state in which the boundaries between self and sword, between intention and action, between technique and spirit, began to dissolve. Advanced training often involved blindfolded practice, forcing students to rely on senses other than sight, developing an almost supernatural awareness of their opponent's position and intentions. They learned to fight in complete darkness, guided only by the sound of footsteps, the whisper of displaced air, the subtle shift in energy that preceded an attack. This training cultivated what the masters called the eye of the mind, a form of perception that transcended ordinary sensory awareness and approached direct intuitive knowledge. The various schools of swordsmanship that emerged during the medieval period each emphasized different aspects of this integration between martial technique and spiritual development. The Yagyu school stressed the importance of psychological dominance, teaching that true victory occurred in the moment when the opponent recognized his own defeat, before any physical technique was employed. The Ito school focused on the principle of one sword, the idea that all technique could be reduced to a single, perfectly executed cut that ended the encounter immediately. The Niton school, founded by the legendary Miyamoto Musashi, explored the use of two swords simultaneously, requiring a level of mental coordination that pushed consciousness beyond its normal limitations. Yet, perhaps the most profound aspect of samurai martial training was its emphasis on accepting death as a precondition for true mastery. Students were taught to meditate on mortality, to visualize their own deaths in vivid detail, to practice dying with dignity and composure. This was not morbid fascination, but practical preparation. A warrior who remained attached to his own survival would always fight defensively, reactively, from a position of weakness. Only by achieving genuine non-attachment to life itself could he discover the paradoxical fearlessness that made survival more likely. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry composition, and other artistic pursuits that occupied so much of samurai attention were not recreational activities, but extensions of martial training. Each required the same qualities needed for combat excellence: precise attention to detail, sensitivity to subtle environmental changes, the ability to perform complex actions with graceful efficiency. A warrior who could arrange flowers with perfect aesthetic balance was developing the same awareness he would need to position himself optimally in battle. One who could compose poetry with emotional depth was cultivating the psychological sensitivity required to read an opponent's intentions. In the deepest teachings of the martial schools, combat itself was understood as a form of spiritual dialogue, a conversation between souls conducted through the medium of steel and technique. The goal was not the crude destruction of an enemy, but the revelation of truth through conflict, the discovery of one's authentic self under the pressure of mortal danger. A truly accomplished warrior sought not to kill his opponents, but to awaken them, to force them to confront their own limitations and transcend them. This transformation of violence into something approaching art, of killing technique into spiritual practice, represented one of human culture's most remarkable achievements. The samurai took the most basic and brutal aspects of animal existence, the struggle for survival through combat, and elevated it into a path toward enlightenment. They demonstrated that consciousness could find meaning and beauty even in the darkest necessities of existence, that human beings could approach even death with grace and dignity when supported by adequate preparation and appropriate philosophy. The wooden practice swords continue their eternal dance in the temple courtyard, cutting patterns in the air that will be repeated by students not yet born, preserving wisdom that transcends any individual life, maintaining a tradition that finds the sacred in the mundane, the eternal in the temporal. In the gentle light of a paper lantern, two men kneel facing each other on tatami mats in the formal reception room of a daimyo's residence, their movements slow and deliberate as they participate in a ceremony that will bind them together more completely than blood, more permanently than law, more sacredly than any religious vow. The younger man, his top knot freshly cut in the style of a warrior, extends his hands to receive a shallow ceramic cup filled with sake. The older man, his kimono bearing the family crest that represents generations of accumulated honor, offers his own cup in return. When they drink, they are consuming more than rice wine. They are accepting a relationship that will define every moment of their remaining lives. This is the Sankon Nogi, the ritual exchange that created the fundamental bond of feudal Japan, the ceremony that transformed two individuals into lord and retainer, binding them in obligations so complete and complex that neither would ever again act solely for his own benefit. The younger man pledges his absolute loyalty, his willingness to sacrifice not only his own life, but the lives of his family members if necessary to serve his lord's interests. The older man accepts the responsibility to protect, guide, and care for his new retainer as he would his own son, understanding that betrayal of this trust would dishonor not only himself, but all his ancestors. Yet to understand this ceremony only in terms of submission and dominance is to miss its profound psychological sophistication. The bonds being created flow both upward and downward through the social hierarchy, creating a web of mutual responsibility that provided both security and meaning in a world where individual survival was never guaranteed. The lord who accepted a retainer's service was simultaneously accepting limitations on his own freedom, obligations that could not be set aside for personal convenience or momentary advantage. Consider the emotional complexity of such relationships from the retainer's perspective. He has chosen to surrender his independent will, to make his lord's welfare more important than his own, to find his identity not in personal achievement, but in perfect service to another. This might seem like mere slavery, yet it contained profound sources of dignity and satisfaction. The retainer knew that his life had purpose beyond his individual desires, that his actions contributed to something larger and more enduring than any single existence. His courage in battle, his wisdom in counsel, his loyalty in times of crisis. The Lord's position carried equal complexity but different burdens. Every decision he made affected not only his own fate, but the welfare of dozens or hundreds of people who had entrusted their lives to his judgment. The retainer who died in battle left behind a widow and children who became the Lord's responsibility to support. The farmer whose crops failed looked to his lord for assistance that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The village threatened by bandits expected protection that might require the lord to risk everything he had built over generations. This network of obligations extended far beyond the immediate relationship between lord and retainer. Each samurai existed within multiple overlapping webs of loyalty and responsibility. He owed service to his immediate superior, but that superior owed service to someone higher in the hierarchy, creating chains of obligation that ultimately connected the lowest-ranking warrior to the shogun himself, and, through the shogun to the emperor, the divine embodiment of Japan itself. The beauty of this system lay in its ability to transform the brutal realities of medieval life into something approaching moral order. Violence became not mere aggression, but the protection of dependents. Warfare became not random destruction, but the fulfillment of sacred obligations. Death became not meaningless tragedy, but the ultimate expression of fidelity to chosen commitments. Picture a typical scene from feudal daily life. A daimyo meets with his senior retainers to discuss the domain's response to drought that threatens the rice harvest. The conversation unfolds with careful attention to protocol, each participant's seating position and speaking order reflecting his place in the hierarchy. Yet the content of their discussion reveals the genuine consultation that characterized good feudal governance. The Lord seeks advice from men whose experience and wisdom he respects, understanding that his authority depends ultimately on their voluntary cooperation rather than mere coercion. The retainers, in turn, offer their opinions with a freedom that might surprise modern observers. They can speak frankly about problems, criticize existing policies, even disagree with their lord's preferred solutions. Not despite their loyalty, but because of it. Their obligation is to serve his best interests, which may sometimes require them to oppose his immediate wishes. The lord who surrounds himself with mere flatterers will soon find his domain in chaos, while one who tolerates honest disagreement from trusted advisors can adapt to changing circumstances and maintain the prosperity that enables everyone's survival. Yet this system also contained profound psychological tensions that created some of Japan's greatest tragedies. What happened when loyalty to one's immediate superior conflicted with loyalty to higher authority? When personal affection clashed with abstract duty? When the Lord himself behaved in ways that violated the moral principles the relationship was supposed to embody? These were not theoretical questions, but practical dilemmas that regularly destroyed lives and occasionally reshaped history. The most famous example remains the story of the 47 Ronin, masterless samurai who avenged their lord's death despite knowing that their action would result in their own execution. Their choice to value loyalty above personal survival inspired countless works of art and literature, becoming perhaps the most beloved story in Japanese culture. Yet, it also illustrated the system's capacity to create impossible situations where honor could only be preserved through self-destruction. The daily practice of feudal relationships required constant attention to subtle psychological dynamics. A retainer had to demonstrate his loyalty without appearing servile, show initiative without seeming presumptuous, maintain his own dignity while acknowledging his superior's authority. A lord had to project strength without becoming tyrannical, show care for his followers without appearing weak, make decisive choices while remaining open to advice from subordinates. These relationships were maintained through elaborate rituals and ceremonial observances that might seem excessive to modern sensibilities, but served essential psychological functions. The formal presentation of New Year gifts, the carefully orchestrated participation in seasonal festivals, the complex protocols surrounding official visits. Women played crucial roles in maintaining these networks of loyalty, often serving as intermediaries who could communicate sensitive information between different levels of the hierarchy without violating formal protocols. A lord's wife might convey his displeasure to a retainer through conversations with the retainer's wife, allowing both men to address problems without direct confrontation that could damage their public relationship. Marriage alliances between families created bonds that supplemented and reinforced the formal ties between lord and retainer, ensuring that personal and political loyalties worked in harmony rather than opposition. The training of children in samurai families emphasized not just martial skills, but the psychological attitudes required for successful participation in feudal relationships. Young people learned to sublimate their individual desires for the sake of family honor, to find satisfaction in perfect performance of assigned roles, to value the approval of superiors more highly than personal comfort or safety. This educational process created personalities uniquely adapted to feudal life, but also uniquely vulnerable to its psychological pressures. As the medieval period progressed, and Japan became increasingly peaceful under Tokugawa rule, these feudal relationships evolved in response to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. Samurai found themselves serving their lords as administrators rather than warriors, but the fundamental structure of mutual obligation remained unchanged. The loyalty that had once been tested on battlefields now expressed itself through careful attention to bureaucratic duties, meticulous maintenance of domain finances, and preservation of cultural traditions that gave meaning to peaceful existence. The legacy of these feudal bonds extends far beyond their historical period, continuing to influence Japanese social relationships even today. The loyalty that modern employees show to their companies, the sense of mutual obligation that characterizes relationships between superiors and subordinates, the emphasis on group harmony over individual expression, all reflect psychological patterns first developed in the context of medieval feudal relationships. In the quiet of evening, as the paper lantern burns lower and the sake cups rest empty on their wooden tray, the ceremony of loyalty reaches its completion. The bonds have been created, the words have been spoken, the commitments have been made. Tomorrow will bring the first test of these new relationships, and every day thereafter will offer fresh opportunities to demonstrate their strength or reveal their limitations. But tonight, in the peace of ritual completion, two men rest in the knowledge that they no longer face the world alone, that they have chosen to bind their fates together in service to something greater than either could achieve in isolation. In the twilight of the Heian period, as court nobles composed their melancholic verses beneath autumn maples, the very foundations of Japanese civilization trembled with approaching transformation. The Genpei War of 1180 to 1185 would prove to be more than a dynastic struggle between the Minamoto and Taira clans. It was the crucible in which Japan's warrior aristocracy would forge their claim to permanent political supremacy, establishing precedents that would govern the archipelago for 7 centuries. The Taira ascendancy had reached its zenith under Taira no Kiyomori, whose red banners fluttered from every significant structure in Kyoto like scarlet promises of martial dominance. Yet this very success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The clan's integration into court society, their adoption of aristocratic refinement, had simultaneously elevated their status and diluted their essential warrior character. When Kiyomori placed his infant grandson on the imperial throne, the delicate balance between military power and traditional legitimacy shattered like ice beneath summer sun. Prince Mochihito's desperate call to arms in 1180 represented more than political rebellion. It was a philosophical watershed that would determine whether Japan's future belonged to courtly aesthetes or warrior pragmatists. The raising of white Minamoto banners in distant provinces signaled not merely the beginning of civil war, but the emergence of an alternative vision of governance rooted in personal loyalty and martial competence rather than inherited privilege and ceremonial precedence. The war's early phases revealed the fundamental military innovations that would characterize samurai warfare. At the Battle of Uji Bridge, warriors faced each other across dark waters illuminated by flickering torchlight, their individual combats determining collective fate in ways that prefigured centuries of Japanese military culture. The emphasis on personal honor, individual prowess, and ritualized combat that emerged during these encounters would distinguish Japanese warfare from the mass formations and technological superiority that characterized contemporary conflicts in China or Europe. Minamoto No Yoshitsune's tactical brilliance exemplified the intellectual sophistication underlying apparent warrior simplicity. His night attack on the Taira stronghold at Ichi no Tani demonstrated how strategic thinking could transform natural terrain into tactical advantage, while his ability to inspire absolute loyalty among diverse retainers illustrated the charismatic leadership that would become essential to samurai political success. Yet Yoshitsune's eventual destruction at his brother Yoritomo's hands revealed the dark undercurrents of suspicion and fraternal rivalry that would plague warrior politics for generations. The war's climactic phase at Dan no Yura possessed all the tragic beauty that would characterize Japanese military romance. As Taira ships burned on the inland sea, the child Emperor Antoku's drowning in his grandmother's arms transformed military defeat into cultural mythology. The image of aristocratic women choosing death over dishonor would resonate through Japanese consciousness, establishing precedents for honor-preserving suicide that would influence samurai behavior across centuries. Victory's aftermath proved as transformative as the conflict itself. Yoritomo's establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate represented a radical departure from traditional Japanese governance, creating institutions that channeled warrior energy toward administrative efficiency, while maintaining the personal bonds that gave samurai society its essential character. The separation of military and court authority, with the emperor retaining ceremonial dignity, while the shogun exercised practical power, established a dualistic system that would prove remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. The war's intellectual legacy proved as significant as its political consequences. The transformation of provincial warriors into national rulers required new justifications for authority, new conceptual frameworks for understanding loyalty and legitimacy. The emergence of military chronicles like the Heike Monogatari demonstrated how warrior society would create its own cultural productions, transforming battlefield experiences into literary achievements that competed with traditional court poetry for artistic recognition. The Kamakura Shogunate's establishment represented one of history's most remarkable experiments in institutional innovation. The transformation of a warrior band into a sophisticated governmental apparatus without sacrificing the essential martial values that legitimized its authority. Minamoto no Yoritomo's decision to establish his capital in the modest coastal settlement of Kamakura, rather than the culturally prestigious but politically treacherous Kyoto, embodied the profound wisdom that would characterize early samurai statecraft. This geographical separation reflected deeper philosophical commitments. Kamakura's unprepossessing wooden buildings housed political innovations that would influence Japanese governance for centuries. The shogun's court deliberately cultivated simplicity over sophistication, functionality over ceremonial magnificence, creating an aesthetic of power that emphasized effectiveness rather than display. This warrior preference for substance over form would become a defining characteristic of Japanese administrative culture. The AUA Joi Code of 132 represented the culmination of this institutional creativity. Japan's first comprehensive legal system, designed specifically for warrior society, it transformed customary practices into systematic jurisprudence while preserving the personal relationships that gave samurai culture its distinctive character. The code's emphasis on precedent and practical resolution of disputes reflected warrior preferences for concrete solutions over abstract legal principles, establishing patterns of Japanese jurisprudence that would persist into the modern era. The shogunate's administrative structure revealed remarkable sophistication in balancing central authority with local autonomy. The system of provincial constables, shugo, and estate stewards, jito, created a network of personal relationships extending from Kamakura to the most remote rice paddies, ensuring that shogunal authority remained grounded in face-to-face loyalty rather than impersonal bureaucratic command. This personalization of political relationships would become a hallmark of Japanese governance, distinguishing it from the more abstract administrative systems developing in contemporary China or medieval Europe. Zen Buddhism's introduction during this period provided intellectual frameworks perfectly adapted to warrior sensibilities. The religion's emphasis on direct experience over textual scholarship, its integration of physical and spiritual discipline, and its aesthetic appreciation for simplicity resonated deeply with samurai values. Zen temples became centers of practical learning, where warriors studied everything from military strategy to poetry composition, creating syntheses of martial and cultural accomplishment that would define samurai ideals for centuries. The period's cultural achievements demonstrated how military patronage could foster artistic innovation. The development of distinctive architectural styles, the refinement of sword-making techniques, and the emergence of military chronicles as literary forms illustrated how warrior society created its own cultural productions while absorbing influences from established court traditions. This creative synthesis would characterize Japanese culture throughout the medieval period. Economic developments during Kamakura rule revealed the practical intelligence underlying warrior governance. The encouragement of agricultural improvement, the development of more sophisticated taxation systems, and the gradual integration of monetary exchange into a previously barter-based economy demonstrated how samurai administrators adapted traditional practices to changing circumstances while maintaining essential social relationships. The shogunate's foreign policy, particularly its response to Mongol diplomatic overtures, illustrated how warrior values influenced international relations. The rejection of subordinate status reflected not mere xenophobia, but philosophical commitments to autonomy and dignity that would characterize Japanese international relations across centuries. The preparation for invasion revealed organizational capabilities that transformed Japan's military potential while preserving the individual warrior ethos that legitimized samurai authority. The Mongol invasions of 174 and 1281 confronted Japanese society with its most severe existential challenge since the Yamato state's consolidation centuries earlier. These campaigns tested not merely military capabilities, but fundamental cultural assumptions about warfare, divine protection, and national destiny that had developed during generations of internal conflict and relative isolation from continental pressures. Kublai Khan's initial diplomatic overtures revealed the cultural chasm separating Mongol and Japanese worldviews. The Great Khan's demands for submission, couched in the universal language of Mongol imperial authority, encountered a Japanese conceptual framework that could not accommodate subordination to foreign power. The shogunate's rejection of these demands reflected not mere political calculation, but deep-seated beliefs about Japan's unique relationship with divine forces that made foreign domination spiritually as well as politically unacceptable. The first invasion's military encounters at Hakata Bay exposed Japanese warriors to combat realities that challenged every assumption about proper martial conduct. Mongol forces employed coordinated archery volleys, explosive devices, and disciplined infantry formations that rendered traditional Japanese single combat not merely ineffective, but actively suicidal. The psychological impact of facing enemies who ignored challenges to individual combat, who fought in anonymous masses rather than seeking personal glory, forced rapid adaptations in both tactical thinking and cultural understanding. Japanese military response demonstrated remarkable flexibility beneath apparent conservative traditionalism. The construction of stone defensive walls along vulnerable coastlines represented unprecedented cooperation between competing domains, while the mobilization of resources from across the archipelago illustrated organizational capabilities that exceeded anything achieved during purely internal conflicts. The integration of mounted samurai with large numbers of foot soldiers armed with various weapons showed how military necessity could modify traditional social distinctions without completely abandoning them. The second invasion's massive scale, 140,000 troops transported across dangerous waters, testified to Mongol organizational capabilities that dwarfed Japanese resources. Yet the Japanese response revealed cultural strengths that material disadvantages could not negate. The coordination of military preparation with religious observance, the way individual acts of heroism inspired collective resistance, and the maintenance of morale, despite overwhelming odds, demonstrated how spiritual resources could complement material defenses. The climactic typhoon that destroyed the Mongol fleet entered Japanese consciousness, not as fortunate coincidence, but as divine intervention, confirming the archipelago's special destiny. The term kamikaze, divine wind, crystallized beliefs about supernatural protection that would influence Japanese strategic thinking for centuries. This interpretation of natural events as expressions of divine will provided psychological resources that enabled Japanese society to process traumatic military encounters as confirmation of national uniqueness rather than evidence of vulnerability. The invasion's aftermath revealed contradictory consequences that would shape Japanese development for generations. Victory confirmation of divine protection paradoxically coincided with financial exhaustion that weakened the very governmental institutions responsible for successful defense. The inability to reward defending warriors with territorial gains created resentments that would undermine shogunal authority, while the demonstration of Japanese military effectiveness encouraged ambitions that would eventually destabilize the carefully constructed balance between central and local power. Religious and cultural responses to the invasions demonstrated how military crisis could catalyze spiritual innovation. The intensification of prayers and ritual observances, the development of new forms of popular Buddhism that emphasized divine protection of the realm, and the emergence of artistic representations celebrating Japanese victory over foreign invaders, all illustrated how external threat could strengthen internal cultural cohesion while providing new frameworks for understanding national identity. The invasion's long-term influence on Japanese strategic culture proved as significant as their immediate military consequences. The experience of facing existential foreign threat while receiving apparent divine protection would influence Japanese responses to international challenges across centuries, creating expectations about supernatural intervention that would persist into the modern era. The integration of spiritual and material preparation for defense established patterns that would characterize Japanese military culture throughout the medieval period. The Kamakura shogunate's gradual decline during the late 13th and early 14th centuries illustrated how success could paradoxically generate the conditions for institutional decay. Victory against the Mongols, rather than strengthening shogunal authority, exposed internal contradictions that 2 centuries of military rule had temporarily obscured but never resolved. The financial crisis following the invasions revealed fundamental structural problems in the warrior economy. Traditional samurai warfare generated territorial spoils that could reward military service, but defensive campaigns against foreign invaders produced no such benefits. The shogunate's inability to compensate defending warriors created resentments that spread through the very social networks that had previously provided governmental stability. Provincial samurai who had mortgaged their lands to finance military service found themselves impoverished by their own loyalty, while moneylenders, often Buddhist temples, accumulated warrior estates through debt foreclosure. Cultural transformations within samurai households reflected broader social changes that challenged traditional warrior values. The increasing sophistication of domestic life, the growing importance of literary and artistic accomplishments alongside martial skills, and the enhanced authority of women in managing family finances all indicated how peace and prosperity were modifying the austere military culture that had originally justified warrior rule. Sons of established samurai families increasingly preferred poetry competitions to archery contests, while daughters received educations that emphasized cultural refinement alongside traditional domestic responsibilities. The proliferation of Buddhist religious movements among ordinary samurai reflected deepening spiritual concerns that purely martial activities could no longer address. The spread of Pure Land Buddhism, with its emphasis on salvation through faith rather than disciplined practice, appealed to warriors seeking spiritual consolation for lives that seemed to lack the clear moral purpose their ancestors had found in constant warfare. Zen Buddhism's influence on warrior culture continued expanding, but its integration with aesthetic pursuits like tea ceremony and flower arrangement indicated how military disciplines were being transformed into cultural practices. Economic changes throughout Japanese society created challenges that existing governmental institutions could not adequately address. The development of more sophisticated commercial networks, the increasing importance of monetary exchange, and the emergence of wealthy merchant families who lacked formal political recognition but wielded considerable practical influence, all strained a system designed for a simpler agricultural economy dominated by warrior landholders. The shogunate's conservative social policies increasingly conflicted with dynamic economic realities. Regional power centers began asserting greater independence as central authority weakened. Powerful Buddhist temples expanded their landholdings and developed their own military forces, creating alternative sources of authority that competed directly with shogunal institutions. Provincial warrior families strengthened their local positions through marriage alliances and economic partnerships that bypassed official administrative channels, gradually constructing networks of power that owed more to regional interests than to central loyalty. The imperial court's growing frustration with military rule provided focus for opposition movements that combined traditional legitimism with contemporary grievances. Emperor Go-Daigo's eventual rebellion would draw support from diverse sources: discontented samurai, ambitious temples, regional strongmen, and court nobles, all united less by shared vision than by common opposition to shogunal authority. This coalition's heterogeneous character would prove both strength and weakness when the time came to replace, rather than merely oppose existing institutions. Intellectual developments during this period reflected broader cultural shifts that challenged warrior political monopoly. The increasing sophistication of legal scholarship, the development of more complex administrative procedures, and the emergence of alternative theories of legitimate authority all indicated how Japanese society was outgrowing the relatively simple institutional arrangements that had served adequately during the shogunate's early decades. The warrior class retained military superiority, but their claim to exclusive political authority faced growing intellectual and practical challenges. The Ashikaga shogunate's establishment in 3036 inaugurated Japan's most paradoxical historical epoch, a period when political fragmentation reached unprecedented extremes while cultural achievement attained heights that would influence Japanese civilization for centuries. This apparent contradiction reflected the fundamental tension between warrior political ambitions and the broader cultural developments that military patronage had originally fostered. Emperor Go-Daigo's Kenmu restoration represented the last serious attempt to restore direct imperial rule, but its failure demonstrated that Japan had evolved beyond the possibility of returning to pre-warrior governmental forms. The restoration's collapse revealed not merely the practical impossibility of displacing entrenched military interests, but the deeper truth that Japanese society had been fundamentally transformed by 2 centuries of warrior influence. The imperial court possessed ceremonial legitimacy, but lacked the administrative capabilities and social connections necessary for effective governance in a society where personal loyalty had replaced bureaucratic hierarchy as the primary organizing principle. Ashikaga Takauji's establishment of a new shogunate in Kyoto attempted to combine warrior authority with traditional court culture, creating a hybrid system that promised to preserve Japanese cultural continuity while adapting to contemporary political realities. The decision to locate the military capital in the traditional imperial city represented a dramatic departure from Kamakura precedents, reflecting confidence that warrior authority had become sufficiently established to coexist with older forms of legitimacy without being corrupted by court sophistication. The period's cultural flowering demonstrated how military patronage could generate artistic innovations that transcended purely martial concerns. The development of Noh drama synthesized warrior themes with court aesthetics, creating theatrical forms that explored psychological depths previously unexpressed in Japanese performance. Zayami's theoretical writings on dramatic art revealed intellectual sophistication that rivaled any cultural production of the classical Heian period, while his practical innovations in staging and performance established aesthetic principles that would influence Japanese theater for centuries. The perfection of the tea ceremony during this period exemplified how warrior patronage could transform practical activities into spiritual practices. Sen-no Rikyu's codification of tea preparation procedures created ritual forms that integrated Zen philosophical principles with aesthetic appreciation of humble objects, demonstrating how warrior spiritual disciplines could generate cultural innovations that appealed to all social classes. The tea ceremony's emphasis on equality among participants, regardless of social rank, reflected warrior values while creating spaces for cultural exchange that transcended traditional hierarchical boundaries. Rock garden design reached unprecedented sophistication during Ashikaga patronage, creating visual representations of Zen philosophy that communicated complex spiritual concepts through careful arrangements of stones and raked gravel. The garden at Ryoan-ji embodied principles of asymmetrical balance and deliberate incompleteness, that would influence Japanese aesthetics across all art forms, while its integration of natural and artificial elements reflected warrior appreciation for practical beauty that served contemplative as well as decorative purposes. The Onin War of 1467–1477 represented the catastrophic breakdown of the delicate balance between central authority and regional autonomy that had characterized early Ashikaga rule. This devastating conflict demonstrated how cultural sophistication could coexist with political barbarism, as the same elite that patronized exquisite artistic productions simultaneously engaged in warfare that reduced Kyoto to ruins and displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians. The war's inconclusive outcome reflected the fundamental problem that would plague late medieval Japan: the absence of any institution capable of imposing permanent peace on competing military factions. The emergence of Gekkokujo, the overthrow of superiors by subordinates, as a recognized political phenomenon, reflected the complete collapse of traditional hierarchical constraints. Provincial governors were displaced by their own deputies, established daimyo were overthrown by ambitious retainers, and even Buddhist abbots faced rebellion from temple communities. This systematic inversion of authority created unprecedented social mobility, while simultaneously destroying the stable relationships that had previously provided security for all social classes. The development of the Sengoku daimyo represented warrior political evolution under conditions of constant warfare. These regional warlords created autonomous kingdoms, complete with law codes, taxation systems, and military organizations that demonstrated remarkable administrative sophistication, despite their relatively limited territorial scope. Domains like those controlled by the Uesugi, Takeda, and Mori clans became laboratories for governmental innovation, developing techniques for resource mobilization and population control that would influence Japanese administration for centuries. Military technology underwent rapid development as constant warfare demanded tactical innovation. The introduction of firearms from Portuguese traders accelerated existing trends toward larger armies and more disciplined formations, while improvements in castle construction created defensive capabilities that could withstand extended sieges. These technological changes gradually undermined the individual warrior ethos that had originally legitimized samurai political authority, replacing personal combat skills with organizational capabilities as the primary determinants of military success. Economic developments during the Sengoku period revealed how constant warfare could stimulate rather than retard commercial growth. The need to finance military campaigns encouraged the development of more sophisticated taxation and monetary systems, while the demand for weapons and supplies created markets that connected previously isolated regions. Merchant families accumulated wealth and influence that began to challenge traditional warrior dominance, creating social tensions that would require resolution by whatever force eventually succeeded in reunifying the fragmented archipelago. The reunification of Japan under three successive military hegemonies, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, represented more than mere political consolidation. It constituted a fundamental transformation of Japanese civilization that would influence the archipelago's development for centuries. Each leader contributed distinctive innovations that collectively revolutionized warfare, governance, and social organization, while establishing precedents that shaped Japan's unique path toward modernity. Oda Nobunaga's radical departure from traditional samurai warfare methods reflected both strategic brilliance and cultural iconoclasm that shocked his contemporaries while proving devastatingly effective. His systematic integration of Ashikaga foot soldiers armed with imported Portuguese firearms represented a conceptual revolution that prioritized tactical efficiency over aristocratic tradition. The Battle of Nagakute demonstrated how disciplined formations of peasant soldiers using coordinated firearm volleys could defeat mounted samurai, whose individual martial prowess had previously determined battlefield outcomes. Nobunaga's destruction of Buddhist military temples revealed the ruthless pragmatism underlying his apparent cultural vandalism. The Enryakuji massacre of 1571, where thousands of monks and civilians were killed without regard for religious sanctuary, eliminated institutional rivals whose spiritual authority had traditionally constrained warrior political ambitions. This systematic elimination of alternative power centers demonstrated how unification required not merely military conquest, but the destruction of competing sources of legitimacy that could justify future rebellion. The political innovations accompanying Nobunaga's military reforms transformed warrior governance from personal relationship networks into systematic administrative hierarchies. The establishment of standardized taxation procedures, the development of professional bureaucracies staffed by merit rather than hereditary status, and the creation of communication systems that enabled rapid coordination across vast territories all indicated how military necessity was generating governmental sophistication that exceeded anything achieved during previous centuries of warrior rule. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's unlikely ascent from sandal-bearer to supreme military commander embodied the social mobility possibilities that constant warfare had created, while simultaneously demonstrating the exceptional personal qualities necessary to exploit such opportunities. His genius for logistics enabled military campaigns on unprecedented scales, while his diplomatic skills allowed him to secure alliances that complemented pure military force. The Korean invasions of 1592 to 1598, despite their ultimate failure, demonstrated organizational capabilities that rivaled anything achieved by contemporary Chinese or European states. Hideyoshi's social engineering policies represented the most systematic attempt to reorganize Japanese society since the ancient Ritsuryo state. The separation of warriors and peasants through the Hinako Bunri Edict eliminated the part-time warrior farmers, who had comprised the backbone of Sengoku period armies, creating distinct social classes with clearly defined functions and obligations. This policy simultaneously strengthened central control by preventing local military organization while providing the demographic stability necessary for agricultural development. The comprehensive land surveys Taiko Kenchi conducted under Hideyoshi's authority created the informational foundation for systematic governance that transformed Japan from a collection of autonomous domains into a unified state. These surveys established standardized measurement units, clarified property relationships, and determined taxation obligations with precision that enabled long-term administrative planning. The resulting knowledge of national resources provided governmental capabilities that exceeded those of many contemporary European states. The introduction of status-based legal codes during Hideyoshi's regime established social boundaries that would influence Japanese development for centuries. The formal separation of samurai, peasant, artisan, and merchant classes, shi no kosho, created hierarchical structures that channeled social energy toward collective rather than individual goals, while the prohibition of status mobility reduced the social volatility that had characterized the Sengoku period. These policies sacrificed individual opportunity for collective stability, reflecting warrior preferences for order over freedom. Military architecture reached unprecedented sophistication during the Unification period, as improved firearms capabilities required defensive innovations that transformed Japanese fortification design. Hideyoshi's castle at Osaka represented the culmination of these developments, combining massive stone foundations with sophisticated wooden superstructures that provided both military functionality and symbolic magnificence. The integration of defensive capabilities with administrative centers demonstrated how military and governmental functions were becoming increasingly unified. Cultural developments during the Unification period reflected the creative synthesis that characterized this era of rapid change. The emergence of kabuki theater provided popular entertainment that celebrated contemporary heroes while preserving traditional artistic forms, while improvements in printing technology enabled the mass production of literature that spread common cultural references throughout the archipelago. These developments created shared cultural experiences that complemented political unification with intellectual integration. Economic policies implemented during the Unification period revealed sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military power and commercial prosperity. The standardization of currency systems, the improvement of transportation networks, and the encouragement of urban development all demonstrated how warfare had generated appreciation for the economic foundations that sustained military capability. The emergence of Osaka as Japan's commercial center reflected recognition that lasting political unification required economic as well as military consolidation. The transformation of warrior culture during this period reflected broader changes in Japanese society that would influence development for centuries. The shift from individual combat to collective discipline, the increasing importance of administrative skills alongside martial prowess, and the development of aesthetic traditions that celebrated both cultural refinement and military effectiveness, all indicated how warrior ideals were adapting to new circumstances while preserving essential characteristics. This cultural evolution prepared the foundation for the peaceful warrior society that would emerge under Tokugawa rule. The Tokugawa shogunate's establishment in 1603 initiated one of history's most remarkable experiments in social engineering, the systematic transformation of Japan's warrior class from active combatants into hereditary administrators governing a peaceful, deliberately isolated society. This transformation required not merely political innovation, but fundamental reconceptualization of warrior identity that preserved essential cultural characteristics while adapting them to radically different circumstances. The Battle of Sekigahara's decisive outcome in 1600 established more than military supremacy. It determined that Japan's future would be shaped by systematic institutional design rather than continuing military competition. Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory represented not merely personal success, but vindication of patient strategic thinking over impulsive martial valor, establishing precedents for governance that would emphasize careful planning and institutional stability over dramatic individual achievement. The Sankin Kotai system exemplified the sophisticated political intelligence that characterized early Tokugawa statecraft. By requiring daimyo to maintain elaborate residences in Edo while leaving family members as hostages, the shogunate transformed potential rebels into participants in an elaborate court system that channeled aristocratic energies toward competitive display rather than military preparation. This brilliant innovation neutralized regional military threats while creating economic relationships that integrated the entire archipelago into a unified commercial system centered on the shogunal capital. The transformation of warrior daily life under Tokugawa rule revealed the profound psychological adaptations required by prolonged peace. Samurai who had trained from childhood for battlefield command found themselves managing account books, writing administrative reports, and attending ceremonial functions that bore little resemblance to their ancestral military functions. The preservation of martial arts practice through systematic kata training represented an attempt to maintain warrior skills in the absence of practical application, transforming combat techniques into aesthetic disciplines that served spiritual rather than military purposes. Educational developments during the Tokugawa period demonstrated how warrior patronage could foster intellectual achievements that transcended purely military concerns. The establishment of domain schools, Hanko, created systematic educational opportunities that combined Confucian classical study with practical administrative training, producing samurai bureaucrats whose intellectual sophistication rivaled that of Chinese scholar officials. These institutions generated cultural productions, historical scholarship, literary criticism, scientific investigation, that established foundations for Japan's later intellectual development. Neo-Confucian philosophy provided intellectual frameworks perfectly adapted to warrior needs for systematic understanding of social relationships and moral obligations. The emphasis on hierarchical harmony, collective responsibility, and personal cultivation through disciplined study resonated deeply with samurai values while offering alternatives to purely military definitions of honorable conduct. Schools like those established by Hayashi Razan and Yamazaki Ansai created distinctively Japanese interpretations of Chinese philosophical traditions that influenced warrior culture for generations. The development of merchant wealth during the Tokugawa peace created subtle challenges to warrior political supremacy that required careful management to preserve social stability. The emergence of families like the Mitsui, whose commercial success generated resources that exceeded those of many daimyo, revealed how economic development was creating new forms of power that existing social categories could not adequately accommodate. The shogunate's response, formal maintenance of warrior superiority combined with practical accommodation of merchant influence, established patterns of adaptation that would characterize Japanese responses to social change throughout the period. Urban culture flourishing during the Tokugawa peace reflected the creative energy that military unification had released for non-military pursuits. The development of sophisticated entertainment districts, the emergence of popular literature that celebrated contemporary urban life, and the refinement of aesthetic traditions like ukiyo-e woodblock printing, all demonstrated how warrior patronage could generate cultural innovations that appealed to all social classes. The integration of warrior and merchant cultural preferences created distinctive Japanese forms of popular culture that influenced artistic development for centuries. The Sakoku isolation policy represented more than mere xenophobia. It constituted a deliberate strategy for preserving social stability by controlling external influences that might disrupt carefully constructed internal relationships. The limited trade relationships maintained with Dutch and Chinese merchants provided access to foreign knowledge and technology, while preventing the cultural contamination that might undermine Confucian social hierarchies. This selective engagement with external influences demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how foreign contact could be managed to serve domestic political objectives. Religious policies during the Tokugawa period revealed systematic attempts to integrate spiritual activities with governmental control. The temple registration system, Terork, transformed Buddhist institutions into administrative agents of the state, while the suppression of Christianity eliminated foreign religious influences that might provide alternative sources of authority. The resulting religious landscape preserved traditional spiritual practices while ensuring they supported, rather than challenged, existing social arrangements. Economic policies implemented during the Tokugawa period demonstrated recognition that lasting political stability required careful management of material resources. The encouragement of agricultural development, the regulation of commercial activities, and the maintenance of transportation networks all indicated how military rulers had learned to appreciate the economic foundations that sustained political authority. The resulting prosperity provided material foundations for cultural achievements while maintaining the social relationships that legitimized warrior rule. The gradual emergence of intellectual challenges to warrior political monopoly during the later Tokugawa period reflected the inevitable consequences of educational development and cultural sophistication. Schools of thought like Kokugaku, national learning, and Rangaku, Dutch learning, provided alternative frameworks for understanding Japanese society that questioned fundamental assumptions about warrior superiority while preserving respect for traditional cultural values. These intellectual developments prepared foundations for the massive transformations that would characterize the modern period. Cultural expressions developed during the Tokugawa peace revealed the creative synthesis of martial and civilian values that characterized this unique historical period. The refinement of martial arts into spiritual disciplines, the development of aesthetic traditions that celebrated both cultural sophistication and warrior heritage, and the creation of popular entertainment that preserved military themes while adapting them to peaceful circumstances, all demonstrated how warrior culture could maintain essential characteristics while serving radically different social functions. The psychological impact of prolonged peace on warrior identity created tensions that would influence Japanese development into the modern era. The preservation of military ideals in the absence of military necessity generated cultural contradictions that found expression in everything from popular literature to political philosophy, creating expectations about honor, duty, and national destiny that would shape Japanese responses to international challenges when the isolation period finally ended. Commodore Matthew Perry's arrival in Edo Bay during July 1853 precipitated more than a diplomatic crisis. It constituted an existential challenge that exposed fundamental contradictions within Tokugawa society, while forcing recognition that Japan's carefully constructed isolation could no longer provide security in an increasingly interconnected world. The Black Ships represented not merely foreign military technology, but alternative possibilities for organizing human society that called into question every assumption underlying 2.5 centuries of warrior rule. The immediate psychological impact of Perry's steam-powered warships transcended their purely military significance. These vessels embodied a relationship between human intelligence and natural forces that challenged fundamental Japanese assumptions about the proper balance between technological capability and spiritual development. The sight of ships moving against wind and current through mechanical power rather than natural forces suggested that foreign civilizations had achieved mastery over physical reality that Japan's traditional wisdom had never contemplated. The Tokugawa government's response to American demands revealed the institutional paralysis that prolonged isolation had generated within Japan's ruling class. Officials trained to manage carefully regulated internal relationships found themselves confronting international pressures for which their experience provided no adequate preparation. The decision to seek advice from daimyo throughout the realm represented unprecedented acknowledgement that existing governmental institutions lacked the knowledge necessary for addressing contemporary challenges. The subsequent years of political crisis exposed deep fissures within Japanese society that successful isolation had temporarily concealed but never resolved. The slogan, Sono Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, provided focus for opposition movements that combined traditional legitimism with xenophobic nationalism. Creating coalitions that challenged Tokugawa authority while offering no coherent alternative program for addressing foreign pressure. The resulting political fragmentation demonstrated how external crisis could catalyze internal conflicts that threatened the very survival of Japanese independence. Regional responses to the foreign crisis revealed the diverse capabilities and perspectives that centralized Tokugawa rule had suppressed for generations. Domains like Satsuma and Choshu, geographically positioned to appreciate international realities through proximity to foreign territories, developed more sophisticated understanding of global power relationships than the isolated Edo government. Their willingness to purchase foreign military technology and employ foreign advisors demonstrated practical flexibility that contrasted sharply with shogunal conservatism. The emergence of the Meiji coalition represented a remarkable synthesis of traditional legitimacy with modernizing ambition that enabled Japan to avoid the colonial subjugation that befell other Asian societies during this period. The Restoration's leaders demonstrated sophisticated understanding that preserving Japanese independence required adopting Western institutional forms while maintaining Japanese cultural identity, a balance that demanded exceptional political intelligence and cultural self-confidence. Military encounters between modernizing and traditional forces during the Boshin War provided dramatic illustration of the technological transformation that foreign contact had made inevitable. The sight of samurai cavalry charging modern rifle formations epitomized the tragic obsolescence of individual martial valor in an age of industrial warfare, while the swift defeat of traditional forces demonstrated that military effectiveness now required institutional rather than personal excellence. Individual responses to the crisis revealed the personal struggles that accompanied this massive historical transformation. Figures like Sakamoto Ryoma, who combined traditional warrior values with international perspective, embodied the intellectual flexibility necessary for navigating between competing demands of cultural preservation and practical modernization. Their ability to envision new possibilities while respecting traditional relationships provided models for the broader social adaptations that successful transition would require. The economic dimensions of the foreign pressure exposed Japan's relative backwardness in industrial development, while simultaneously providing opportunities for rapid advancement through technology transfer. The unequal treaties imposed by foreign powers created immediate challenges to national dignity, while offering access to knowledge and techniques that could strengthen Japan's long-term competitive position. This paradoxical situation required political leadership capable of accepting short-term humiliation for long-term advantage. Cultural responses to foreign pressure revealed both the resilience and adaptability of Japanese civilization. The emergence of movements like Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army, demonstrated how traditional concerns for national strength could incorporate modern institutional forms, while the preservation of distinctive Japanese approaches to foreign learning showed how external influences could be absorbed without destroying essential cultural characteristics. role of lower-ranking samurai in driving political change illustrated how crisis could release social energies that normal circumstances kept suppressed. Young warriors who possessed sufficient education to understand international realities but lacked high official positions that might constrain their responses became catalysts for transformations that their social superiors found difficult to envision or implement. Their combination of traditional values with modernizing ambitions provided leadership for changes that preserved essential Japanese characteristics while adapting to contemporary necessities. The intellectual ferment generated by foreign contact produced new frameworks for understanding Japanese identity that would influence national development for generations. The recognition that Japan must change to remain Japanese created philosophical challenges that required unprecedented synthesis of traditional wisdom with foreign knowledge. The resulting intellectual innovations established foundations for Japan's distinctive approach to modernization that avoided both complete westernization and reactionary isolation. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 represented the final, tragic chapter in the samurai's long journey from medieval warriors to cultural symbols, a poignant last stand that transformed political failure into mythological triumph. Saigo Takamori's revolt against the Meiji government he had helped create embodied all the contradictions that had come to define the warrior class in an age when their traditional functions had become obsolete, yet their cultural significance remained profound. The rebellion's origins lay in the rapid social transformations that followed the Meiji Restoration, changes that had proceeded with such breathtaking speed that even their architects struggled to comprehend their full implications. The abolition of the domain system in 1871, the prohibition of sword-wearing in 1876, and the establishment of a conscript army composed of peasants rather than hereditary warriors represented systematic dismantling of the social structure that had defined Japanese civilization for 7 centuries. For many samurai, these reforms constituted not mere policy changes, but existential threats to their very identity. Saigo Takamori's complex relationship with modernization reflected the broader ambivalence that many thoughtful warriors felt toward the new order they had helped establish. As one of the Meiji Restoration's primary architects, he possessed intimate understanding of the practical necessities that drove governmental policy, yet his deep attachment to traditional values made him increasingly uncomfortable with the materialistic direction that modernization seemed to require. His resignation from the government in 1873, ostensibly over career policy, but fundamentally concerning the pace and character of social change, symbolized the painful choice between political effectiveness and spiritual integrity that confronted all conscientious samurai. The gathering of displaced warriors in Satsuma Domain during the mid-1870s created a unique cultural environment where traditional values could be preserved and celebrated, even as the broader society moved inexorably toward Western-style modernization. The private schools established by Saigo's followers provided education that combined classical Chinese learning with martial arts practice, creating spaces where young men could experience something approximating the warrior culture their fathers had known. These institutions became centers of opposition to governmental policies, not through explicit political organization, but through their very existence as alternatives to the educational and social models the Meiji state promoted. The rebellion's immediate trigger, government attempts to remove weapons from Satsuma arsenals, provided the practical catalyst for a conflict that had deeper philosophical roots in competing visions of Japan's future direction. Saigo's reluctant acceptance of leadership reflected not personal ambition, but recognition that the values he represented required defense, even when such defense appeared practically hopeless. His decision to rebel constituted an act of moral witness rather than political calculation, an attempt to preserve something essential about Japanese civilization that rapid modernization threatened to destroy. The military conduct of the rebellion demonstrated both the continued valor of traditional warriors and their inevitable obsolescence in the face of modern military technology. The sight of samurai armed with swords and spears facing government forces equipped with modern artillery and rifles provided dramatic illustration of the historical transition Japan was experiencing. Yet the rebels' consistent courage under impossible circumstances, their maintenance of traditional military courtesy even toward enemies, and their refusal to abandon positions despite overwhelming disadvantage created powerful examples of warrior virtue that resonated throughout Japanese society. The siege of Kumamoto Castle revealed the complex relationship between tradition and modernity that characterized this final samurai conflict. The castle's successful defense by government forces symbolized the institutional strength of the new order, while the rebels' persistent attacks demonstrated the continued power of individual courage and determination. The contrast between the disciplined volleys of conscript soldiers and the individual heroics of samurai warriors epitomized the broader transformation of Japanese military culture, from personal combat to collective organization. Individual acts of heroism during the rebellion created legends that would influence Japanese culture for generations. Stories of wounded samurai continuing to fight despite mortal injuries, of warriors committing suicide rather than accepting defeat, and of leaders maintaining ceremonial dignity even in desperate circumstances, provided models of behavior that transcended immediate military significance. These examples of devotion to principle, despite practical futility, appealed to Japanese sensibilities in ways that mere military success could never achieve. The rebellion's final phase at Shiroyama possessed all the tragic beauty that would ensure its permanent place in Japanese cultural memory. Saigo's decision to face certain death, rather than surrender or escape, reflected traditional warrior values carried to their logical extreme, while his followers' willingness to share his fate demonstrated the continuing power of personal loyalty in an age increasingly dominated by abstract institutional relationships. The image of the last samurai choosing honorable death over compromised survival created a powerful cultural symbol that would influence Japanese attitudes toward duty and sacrifice for generations. The rebellion's aftermath revealed the complex relationship between political failure and cultural victory that would characterize Japanese memory of the samurai throughout the modern period. Saigo's transformation from rebel to national hero occurred with remarkable speed, reflecting popular recognition that his opposition to modernization represented not mere reactionary resistance, but principled defense of values that rapid social change threatened to abandon entirely. The government's decision to posthumously pardon the rebellion's leaders demonstrated official acknowledgement that their motives, however misguided politically, deserved respect and commemoration. The cultural impact of the Satsuma rebellion extended far beyond its immediate military significance, providing Japanese society with powerful symbols for understanding the relationship between tradition and modernity that would continue to define national identity throughout the modern period. The image of warriors choosing death over dishonor resonated with Japanese, confronting their own challenges in adapting to changing circumstances while preserving essential cultural characteristics. The rebellion's legacy would influence everything from popular literature to military culture, providing models of behavior that emphasized spiritual values over material success. The international attention attracted by the rebellion revealed global fascination with the samurai as symbols of alternative approaches to honor and duty that industrial civilization seemed to be abandoning. Foreign observers' romantic interpretations of the rebels' motivations and conduct contributed to worldwide interest in Japanese culture that would influence international perceptions of Japan for generations. This global attention paradoxically ensured that the samurai would achieve greater international recognition through their final defeat than they had ever received during centuries of political dominance. The samurai's transformation from historical actors to cultural symbols represents one of the most remarkable examples of how defeated traditions can achieve victory through mythological resurrection, influencing societies far beyond their original temporal and geographical boundaries. The warrior class's political extinction in 1877 marked not the end of their influence, but the beginning of their most profound impact on human consciousness, as their ideals spread throughout Japanese society and eventually across the globe. The Meiji government's deliberate cultivation of samurai values as elements of national character demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how traditional virtues could serve modern purposes. The concept of Yamato Damashi, Japanese spirit, or Japanese spirit, incorporated warrior ideals of loyalty, self-sacrifice, and dedication to collective goals into civic virtues suitable for citizens of a modern state. The transformation of feudal loyalty into patriotic devotion, of personal honor into professional integrity, and of martial discipline into industrial efficiency showed how ancient values could adapt to contemporary circumstances without losing their essential character. Japanese business culture's distinctive characteristics reflect profound samurai influence on corporate organization and management philosophy. The emphasis on long-term relationships over short-term profit, the importance of collective responsibility and consensus decision-making, and the expectation that employees will demonstrate loyalty and dedication that transcends purely contractual obligations, all echo traditional warrior values adapted to commercial circumstances. The concept of kaizen, continuous improvement, embodies the samurai commitment to perfection through disciplined practice, while corporate hierarchies often mirror the personal relationships that characterized feudal military organization. The global fascination with samurai culture reveals universal human hunger for alternatives to purely materialistic definitions of success and meaning. The warrior class's combination of physical prowess with aesthetic sensitivity, their integration of practical effectiveness with spiritual development, and their demonstration that strength and refinement could coexist within a single cultural ideal, continue to appeal to people seeking models for living that transcend narrow specialization. Martial arts practice worldwide preserves not merely combat techniques, but philosophical approaches to personal development that originated in medieval Japanese warrior culture. Contemporary Japanese arts preserve and extend aesthetic principles that developed under samurai patronage, demonstrating the continuing vitality of cultural traditions that emerged from military contexts. The spare beauty of modern Japanese architecture reflects warrior preferences for functional elegance over decorative excess, while the disciplined precision of industrial design embodies the same attention to detail that characterized traditional sword-making. The integration of form and function that defines Japanese aesthetic sensibility originated in warrior culture, where beauty and effectiveness were considered inseparable aspects of excellence. The persistence of hierarchical relationships and group-oriented decision-making in contemporary Japanese society reflects institutional patterns that developed during centuries of warrior rule. The importance of consensus building, the respect for seniority and experience, and the emphasis on collective harmony over individual expression all demonstrate how samurai social organization continues to influence modern Japanese behavior. These characteristics provide both strengths and challenges for Japanese society as it adapts to globalizing pressures that often emphasize individual achievement and competitive relationships. Critical evaluations of samurai legacy acknowledge both positive contributions and potential limitations of warrior cultural inheritance. While samurai values of discipline, loyalty, and dedication to excellence continue to provide valuable models for personal and social development, their emphasis on hierarchy and conformity can sometimes discourage innovation and individual expression. The challenge for contemporary societies influenced by samurai culture lies in preserving valuable traditional virtues while adapting them to circumstances that require flexibility and creativity, as well as discipline and loyalty. The samurai's greatest achievement may have been their demonstration that human excellence requires integration of multiple dimensions of development, rather than narrow specialization in single areas of competence. Their combination of martial prowess with artistic sensitivity, practical effectiveness with spiritual depth, and individual achievement with social responsibility provides models for balanced human development that remain relevant in an age when technological advancement often outpaces wisdom and moral understanding. The continuing global interest in samurai culture suggests that their influence will persist as long as human beings struggle to balance competing demands of effectiveness and meaning, individual achievement and social responsibility, material success, and spiritual fulfillment. Their legacy offers hope that such integration remains possible, providing inspiration for those seeking to create lives and societies that honor both practical necessity and higher human aspirations. In this sense, the samurai achieved a form of immortality that transcends political power or military victory, becoming permanent symbols of humanity's capacity for noble achievement, even under the most challenging circumstances.